some friends. One of the friends that I'm sure many of you know, most of you probably know, David Vega, said, "Chief, tell the story. Tell the story that you told." And I don't know how many years ago it was, Brandy, that I told this story, and David has hung on to it since then, and he said, "Please tell that story tomorrow." And so I kind of changed things up, and I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to spend the rest of my time this afternoon telling you a story that I want you to think about. Now, I'm a firefighter, and for all the law enforcement officers in the room, kind of get past that. I'm telling it in the voice of a firefighter, but you've been there. You've seen the same kind of call that I'm going to talk about. You have been there. But it's not for firefighters, and it's not for law enforcement officers. It's really for everybody. It's a story about humanity and how some of us who got into this work have kind of lost sight of the reason that we're really here. So let me start off telling you that, like any good fire department story, this one happened truly in the wee hours of the morning on a cold winter's night. Unusual for Colorado Springs, it had been snowing almost all day. And throughout the day, we'd accumulated about 10 inches of snow on the ground, and that doesn't happen very often in our town. The day wasn't particularly busy in the firehouse. We had a handful of medical calls. We had a dumpster fire that I can remember, but other than that, you know, the calls come and go, and none of them really registered with me. The day kind of went on, and as we got into the evening hours, we kind of made our way to the kitchen, where one of the firefighters prepared a meal, and the rest of us took our turns poking fun at him and for the meal that he made, but we all ate it. Then after the meal, dishes were done, everybody kind of makes their way into the lounge room, and yes, for all the law enforcement officers, I'm here to admit it, we do have recliners in the firehouses. Everybody's flaked out on the recliners, we got our remotes in our hands, and we're doing a couple of hours of kind of mindless channel surfing. One by one, people start to go off to bed. I'm kind of a late night guy, and I've always been a late night guy, so I stayed up a little bit later, probably around midnight or so. I'm one of the last ones to go off into bed and try to get some rest for the evening. Somewhere around 4 o'clock in the morning, the alarm goes off. The tones sound, the lights come on. In those days, we kept our bunker boots right next to our beds. I was a brand new lieutenant. Roll out of bed, step into my bunker boots, pull up the suspenders, and within about a minute, we're strapped into Big Red and we're rumbling down the road going off to our emergency. It's right about then that the wide-awake voice of the dispatcher comes over the radio waves and says, "Engine 10, you're responding on a man who slipped out of bed." You could almost hear the eyeballs of 4 grown men rolling around in their silence. I mean, are you kidding me? Now, I can't speak for the rest of the team, but I can tell you that some pretty selfish and pretty thoughtless thoughts went through my mind. Really, you calling 911 because you slipped out of bed? 4 highly trained professionals are strapped into, at that time, a $250,000 piece of equipment, running emergent with lights and sirens on because somebody slipped out of bed? Are you kidding me? Well, that's what was going on in my mind, but I didn't let that out of my mouth. Within a couple of minutes, we pull up in front of this modest little house. Got a little chain link fence that goes around the front yard. Lots of snow on the ground. I'm a professional, so I put on my game face, get off the apparatus, and the 4 of us make our way through the little fence, and we walk up to the front porch. And right as we're approaching the porch, the door swings open, and there's an elderly lady standing in the doorway. Her shoulders are hunched over, look like they're being pressed down with the weight of all those years pushing down on her. First words out of her mouth, "Sorry to bother you, boys. Coming out of the cold." So we walk in, she shuts the door, and I do that thing that all firefighters and law enforcement officers do, right? You get a little bit of situational awareness, you look around the room and see what you can see. So I look around, and directly in front of us where we walked in the door, a few steps up was a kitchen, real small, little round table, 2 placemats set at the round table. In the living room, small also, side-by-side rockers with a little table in between them, sitting in front of a console television. I told you it was a long time ago, okay? It was a console TV, it wasn't hanging on the wall. Against the other wall, underneath the mirror, underneath the picture window, was a little couch. It looked like it had like a hand-knitted Afghan draped over the back of it. All of the furnishings in the house just seemed small and aged, kind of like our hostess. And speaking of our hostess, even though she had called 911, she didn't seem to be in a terrible hurry. She said, "He's right this way," and she started to take those halting little steps as she went down the hallway. And her hallway was lined with pictures. And she didn't waste that time. She introduced us to every member of her family. She told us about all of her children who had all gone and moved out of state, how many grandchildren that they've given her, how many times or really how infrequently they visited. And as she moved on, she stopped in front of another picture. This one was of a young man, brilliant smile, big shock of blonde hair, standing with his elbow against the propeller of an aircraft, wearing a leather aviator's jacket. And she said, she seemed to straighten up a little bit. She said, "This is my husband. He joined the Army Air Corps in World War II. He fought there, he fought in Korea. He didn't retire until Vietnam." She takes a couple more steps. This time she stops in front of another picture. This picture is a little yellowed and it's wavy in its frame. Same guy with the bright smile and the big blonde hair, but this time his arm is wrapped around the waist of a raven-haired beauty. It was a wedding photograph. She didn't say anything. This time she just kissed her fingers, reached up and touched her husband's face. She turned and she said, "He's right here." And she walked into his bedroom. Now immediately when I saw him, I knew that that was the same man that was in the pictures. She had told us that he retired as a full bird colonel. But now the colonel is trapped between a nightstand and a twin-size bed. He's emaciated and thin. He's wearing nothing more than an adult diaper and a pajama top. I remember going in there and first words out of his mouth, his little thin arms are reached out and he's still trying to pull himself upright. And he echoes his wife's words. "Sorry to bother you, boys." I can still remember cradling the colonel in my arms and lifting him back into bed. I could feel the bumps of his spine pressing against my forearm. There wasn't much left of him, pretty easy to pick up and set into bed. As we're going about our business, the colonel and his wife start telling us that they had spent the last 2 hours trying to get him back in bed. You see, at some time during the middle of the night, this once proud man had just rolled a little bit too far, slipped out of bed and got trapped on the floor. And he and his wife spent 2 hours trying to get him back up and put him back into bed. We got him into bed and adjusted his blankets, adjusted his pillow, tried to make everything just right. We checked his vital signs. Out of habit, more than anything, he wasn't hurt. Once we did that, the rest of the crew and the colonel's wife go back out into the rest of the house, and I stayed there with the colonel for a few minutes. He had tears in his eyes when he looked up at me, and with a real raspy voice, he said, "Thank you." I said, "You're welcome, Colonel." And with that, he raises a quivering arm, and he gives me a salute. Well, I've never been in the military, but I understand protocol. And I know it's the lower rank that salutes the higher rank, and then the higher rank is supposed to return that salute in like kind. I couldn't salute the colonel. Couldn't salute the colonel. Couldn't do it. Instead, I just reached out and grabbed his hand. I said, "Sir, promise me you'll never wait 2 hours again. Promise me you'll call just as soon as you need us. We work for you, Colonel. 5 minutes away. You don't have to spend 2 hours on the floor. Just give us a call." And now with tears that were flowing freely, he said, "Thank you, son." I walked out into the rest of the house, and firefighters are doing what firefighters do, man. They had taped down a throw rug in the kitchen to make sure there wasn't going to be a trip hazard. They had changed the batteries in the smoke alarms, and they even made an appointment to come back the next day to give them a carbon monoxide detector free of charge. We gathered up all of our gear, made our way back out to the pumper. I got to tell you, it was a pretty quiet ride on the way back. Not a lot of talking going on. I think each one of us was processing what we had just done. Got back to the fire station, and the darkness of the night was giving way to the dawn. Light was just coming over the horizon. I could probably play off the tears in my eyes or just being tired. The rest of the crew gets off of the apparatus, go back into the bedroom to get a few more minutes of sleep, and being a man of faith, I sat there in the front seat of that engine and I prayed. See, I asked God to never let me miss humanity for my own convenience ever again. Got out of the apparatus, went into the kitchen, made a pot of coffee, and before long, firefighters start coming out one at a time, drinking coffee. Wasn't very long before the oncoming shift started to come in to relieve us, and I found myself standing out on the apparatus floor next to the engine and telling the oncoming lieutenant about the previous shift and that all the equipment was replaced, and just doing that trade-off that we become so customary to us. And in the midst of that, I started to tell him about the colonel and his wife, and I said, last night and early this morning we went out on a man who had slipped out of bed, and I barely got the words out of my mouth when a young firefighter standing next to him says, "Oh, I hate those bogus calls." I could feel my gut tighten. With everything I could muster, I said, "It wasn't a bogus call. Come with me." And I walked away because I was afraid I'd probably tear up again, and you don't want to do that in the firehouse. I walked over to the back of the fire station and I had a discussion with that young man. And I told him the story of the colonel and his wife. You see, this guy he allowed us to be his hero that night, but decades before any of us were ever born, he was our hero. Fighting for your liberty. I explained that to that firefighter, and I told him, never let your inconvenience keep you from doing the job that you're sworn to do. You see, because the kicker is that while we were helping the colonel and his wife, we didn't miss any critical traumas, no working structure fires. There was nothing going on. We didn't have an extrication that we missed or anything like that. All we missed was a few minutes in bed. That's a trade I'll make every day. I tell that story often because I never want to forget why I'm in this line of work. I never want to impose on our citizens my definition of an emergency. They get to do that themselves. Now, certainly there's some calls that I don't think are emergencies either, but why do we make our minds up before we even get there? Give yourselves the opportunity to meet the colonel, to meet his wife, to see their need, to react to their need and make their day better. That's what we're called to do. It's a privilege to be able to respond to people in their need. And all too often, we substitute our definition for their definition, and we dismiss them before they've had an opportunity to even meet us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me down to San Juan County. It is an honor to be here today. It's an honor to see this many people gathered together, knowing what you're going to do, knowing that in September you're going to gather together and the culminating event is going to be a full-scale active shooter exercise in a church. Why are you doing that? Because you want to be the very best that you can be in that time of crisis to care for the people that are your neighbors, your friends, and your family. Thank you for your time.